As the NFL season winds down, it's time to look back at who Michael Fabiano picks for his fantasy Pro Bowlers. Now, with me is SI fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano. And Fabs, even though there's no NFL Pro Bowl this year, you wanted to make sure that these guys got their own credit for their incredible performances in fantasy football this year. Starting off with the quarterback, who do you have, and where would you draft this guy next season?
Well, it's funny too because the Pro Bowl started in 1970, right, with the merger. The winning teams got $2,000 for those players, and last year the winning players in the Pro Bowl, 70 grand. So things have changed, and of course there is no Pro Bowl because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that's not stopping me from giving my Pro Bowl picks at quarterback. I'm going with Josh Allen. He led all quarterbacks with over 396 fantasy points. He was tremendous all season long. And actually, his 396.1 fantasy points is the fifth most ever scored by a quarterback in the Super Bowl era. His fantasy point totals have risen in each of his 3 years in the NFL. I would say he's probably the QB2 or QB3 at worst in 2021 drafts.
All right, let's move over to running backs, where a few guys dominated as usual, but you can only pick one. So who's your running back Pro Bowler, and where would you take him next year?
Yeah, and that's Alvin Kamara. He led all running backs with over 377 fantasy points. He was tremendous. He actually scored 50 more points than the RB2. That was Dalvin Cook. He had that monster game on Christmas with 6 touchdowns that led countless fantasy fans to a championship. And he has been so consistent. 320 plus fantasy points in 3 of his first 4 NFL seasons. He has had 326 combined receptions over his first 4 years. That's the most of any running back in their first 4 NFL campaigns. And next year, he's going to be a top 5 pick, but Bill, where in the top 5? Because we're not sure who the quarterback's going to be in New Orleans next season.
Certainly sounds like it could be either Taysom Hill or Jameis Winston, but you're right. That could have a big impact on Alvin Kamara's fantasy status. Let's move over to wide receiver, where there's always a lot of studs, but hey, at least you get to take 2 of the players to the fantasy Fabiano's fantasy Pro Bowl.
And the first guy is obvious. It's Devontae Adams. Led all wide receivers, nearly 360 fantasy points. He finished with 18 touchdown catches. That's tied with Mark Clayton and Sterling Sharp. Remember those guys for the 3rd most recorded in a single season in the Super Bowl era among wide receivers. He's had 23 touchdown catches since 2019. And as long as Aaron Rodgers is back in Green Bay, and I think he will be, Devontae Adams will be worth a first-round pick in 2021. Same goes with Tyreek Hill, who's probably going to be drafted somewhere around the turn in the 1st or 2nd round. 17 total touchdowns, just behind Devontae Adams in touchdowns and fantasy points. He had that huge game, ironically, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who will face in the Super Bowl. Almost 58 fantasy points. That was in Week 12. That was the highest scoring game of any wide receiver in the season. And with Patrick Mahomes under center, Tyreek Hill is going to be a wide receiver 1 for a long, long time.
All right, now we're talking about Tyreek Hill. We're talking about Patrick Mahomes. I guess we're going to talk about their tight end here. I'm assuming you have Travis Kelsey as your Pro Bowler tight end for your fantasy Pro Bowl.
I was going to Robert Tonyan, man. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, of course it's Kelsey. I mean, this is the 5th year in a row. He's been the #1 tight end in fantasy football, 5 years in a row. Almost 313 fantasy points. It's the 2nd most points scored by a tight end in a single season since Rob Gronkowski had 330.9 in 2011. Kelsey also set the record for receiving yards in a single season among tight ends. He may go down as the best offensive tight end in the history of the National Football League. And this guy is probably going to be a 1st or 2nd round pick across the board in 2021.
And then let's throw in a flex. There's no flex in the Pro Bowl, but in the Fabiano's fantasy Pro Bowl, there certainly is. And I'm hoping that you're going to include a running back here, because we short-sighted a few of them by only giving one to Alvin Kamara.
Yeah, and you can go Derrick Henry here, but I went with Dalvin Cook. He had over 1,900 scrimmage yards. He scored nearly 340 fantasy points. He had 17 total touchdowns. That tied Derrick Henry for 2nd among running backs. He's also one of those elusive backs, right? He finished 2nd at the position in broken tackles and yards after contact. And I feel like he's going to be either 1 or 2 in almost every draft next season. He's either going to go ahead of Christian McCaffrey or just behind him. But Dalvin Cook has established himself as an elite fantasy back.
When it comes to fantasy football, we try to keep things going all year round. You can check more of Michael Fabiano's excellent insight by going to si.com/fantasy.